The Bad News Bears felt like we had made it.
Somewhere in the swamps south of Orlando, a dog is sniffing the humid air, tail stiff, nose twitching, completely ignoring the alligator sunning itself 20 feet away. The dog isn't hunting deer. It isn't hunting rabbits. It's hunting one of the most feared invasive predators on the planet, and it's better at the job than almost any human alive. When Florida wildlife officials first floated the idea of using specially trained animals, radio tag decoys, and an army of paid hunters to fight back against an explosion of giant constrictor snakes, plenty of people online rolled their eyes. Snakes fighting snakes. Dogs sniffing out snakes. Thousands of people combing swamps for a bounty. It sounded like a punchline. Then the numbers started coming in, and nobody was laughing anymore. Today, we're breaking down the real story behind Florida's strange, controversial, and surprisingly effective war on invasive snakes. And stick around, because the strategy that worked the best is the one that got mocked the hardest. To understand why Florida got this desperate, you have to understand how bad the Everglades situation actually became. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, and they have no business being anywhere near South Florida. But starting in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, the exotic pet trade brought thousands of these snakes into private homes across the state. They grow fast. They grow long. A hatchling the size of a shoelace can become a 16-foot, 200-pound animal within a few years, and plenty of owners simply weren't prepared for that. Some pythons escaped during storms. Some were deliberately released into canals and swampland when they became too large or too expensive to keep. And in 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore through a python breeding facility near the Everglades, scattering an unknown number of snakes directly into prime wetland habitat. The Everglades turned out to be close to perfect for them. Warm, wet, thick with cover, and absolutely stuffed with prey that had never evolved any defense against an ambush predator this size. Marsh rabbits, raccoons, opossums, and deer populations in python-heavy areas didn't just decline. In some survey zones, they collapsed by more than 90%. Researchers doing road count surveys in the early 2000s versus the 1990s found staggering drops in mammal sightings across the same routes. Wading birds, bobcats, even the occasional alligator turned up as python meals. This wasn't an ecosystem with a new resident. This was an ecosystem being rewritten from the bottom up. By the time state and federal wildlife agencies fully grasped the scale of it, estimates of the python population in South Florida range from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands, spread across a region so dense with sawgrass, cypress, and standing water that finding a single camouflage snake felt almost impossible. Pythons are ambush predators. They don't move much. Their skin pattern is built to disappear against leaf litter and shadow. Traditional hunting methods, walking transects and hoping to spot one, worked, but painfully slowly. Florida needed something smarter. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, and where a lot of the internet mockery started. Researchers realized that male Burmese pythons are relentless when it comes to finding mates during breeding season. A male will travel astonishing distances, sometimes tracking a female's scent trail for miles through dense wetland, driven by instinct that no human tracker could replicate. So scientists asked a simple but slightly unsettling question. What if we let the snakes find each other for us? The result became known informally as the Judas Snake Program, borrowed from a much older wildlife management technique used on invasive goats and pigs. Researchers surgically implanted radio transmitters into captured male pythons and released them back into the wild during breeding season. The tagged males, driven by nothing but instinct, would set off in search of females, and researchers would track the signal. More often than not, the male would eventually lead them directly to a large, breeding-age female, sometimes coiled together with multiple other males in what researchers call a breeding aggregation. The payoff was enormous relative to the effort. A single tagged male python, tracked over a season, could lead researchers to remove several dozen pounds of breeding female python and, crucially, prevent that female from laying a clutch of eggs. A single female Burmese python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a season. Removing one gravid female before she nests can, in a single afternoon, prevent the equivalent damage of removing dozens of adult snakes later. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida, One of the organizations running this research reported male python scouts leading teams to stand out numbers of pythons that traditional searching would likely have missed entirely. It is, in the driest possible sense, one of the more effective wildlife control tools ever deployed against this species, and it works because the state leaned into the snake's own biology instead of fighting against it. While researchers were turning snakes against snakes, another program was quietly proving even more effective at the detection stage: dogs. Specifically, dogs trained through a partnership involving Auburn University's Canine Detection Program, working with Florida wildlife agencies to see whether a dog's nose could outperform a human eye in dense wetland terrain. It turns out the answer was not close. In controlled field trials comparing human searches to detection dogs covering the same plots of habitat, the dogs found more pythons, found them faster, and had a dramatically lower false negative rate. Pythons rely almost entirely on camouflage to avoid detection by sight, and that camouflage is essentially useless against a nose. A dog doesn't care that a 5-foot python is lying motionless under 3 inches of leaf litter with its pattern blending perfectly into the shadows. The dog smells it anyway. The trained dogs used in these programs, breeds selected for scent work and trainability, were taught to alert their handlers without engaging the snake directly, since even a detection dog has no business getting close to an animal that can deliver a nasty bite or, with a large enough snake, considerably worse. Handlers would then move in to safely capture or euthanize the animal according to state protocol. Early skepticism about the program was loud. Wildlife message boards and social media comment sections were full of people joking that Florida was sending golden retrievers into gator-infested swamps to fight giant snakes, and admittedly, on paper, it does sound like a joke. But the field data told a different story. Detection dog teams consistently and measurably outperformed unassisted human searches, and the program has since been cited by wildlife agencies in other states dealing with their own invasive reptile problems as a model worth replicating. The third and most publicly visible piece of Florida's strategy wasn't an animal at all, it was people, and a lot of them. The state's Python Elimination Program, run through the South Florida Water Management District and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, pays contracted hunters an hourly wage plus per-foot bonuses for every python they remove from public lands, with larger bonuses for snakes carrying viable eggs. This wasn't a small pilot project. Over the life of the program, contracted hunters working under FWC and the Water Management District have removed well over 20,000 pythons from South Florida since organized removal efforts began, with the pace accelerating significantly in recent years as tracking technology and hunter experience improved. Some of the program's top hunters have personally removed hundreds of snakes, developing a kind of specialized expertise in reading python sign, subtle disturbances in vegetation, characteristic trails through mud that most people would walk straight past. Layered on top of the paid contractor program is the Florida Python Challenge, an annual public hunting competition that has, in some years, drawn well over 1,000 registered participants from across the country and even internationally, competing for cash prizes tied to the number and size of pythons they remove within a set window. Critics initially dismissed it as a publicity stunt more likely to generate viral hunting videos than meaningful ecological impact, and it's true that the challenge alone removes a relatively small fraction of the total python population in any given year. But its real value turned out to be different than expected, raising public awareness, funding research, and identifying a pool of skilled amateur hunters who sometimes go on to become paid contractors. The mockery aimed at recreational python hunting tournaments quieted considerably once the scale of participation and the total combined removal numbers across all of Florida's programs became clear. Perhaps the single most surprising chapter in this whole saga involves a tribe of snake catchers from Tamil Nadu in southern India. The Irula are traditionally a hunter-gatherer community with a centuries-old, almost legendary skill for locating and safely handling venomous and non-venomous snakes alike, a skill historically used both for traditional medicine and, more recently, for extracting venom used in antivenom production back in India. In 2017, conservation researchers arranged for a small group of Irula tribesmen to travel to Florida specifically to demonstrate their tracking techniques in the Everglades. The results made headlines across the wildlife world. Within roughly 2 weeks, the visiting hunters captured more than a dozen pythons, including some of the largest individuals caught in the area up to that point, using nothing but their traditional hand-tracking methods: no dogs, no radio transmitters, just an extraordinary ability to read faint signs most trained American researchers had never learned to notice. One of the snakes they helped locate stretched over 16 feet. The visit wasn't framed as a permanent solution, more of a proof of concept and a knowledge exchange, but it drove home an important point that shaped how Florida approached the broader python problem afterward. Expertise matters enormously in this kind of work, and different traditions of tracking and observation, whether from tribal hunters, trained detection dogs, or biologists using radio telemetry, each brought something the others couldn't replicate on their own. It's worth pausing on why any of this became a punchline at all, because the ridicule wasn't random. Every individual piece of Florida's strategy, on its own, does sound a little absurd out of context. Surgically implant a python with a tracking chip and let it loose to find its girlfriend. Train a house pet to sniff out an apex predator in a swamp full of alligators. Fly hunters in from another continent to catch snakes by hand. Pay strangers cash prizes to wrestle giant constrictors for a weekend. Stacked together and stripped of context, it reads like satire. There's also a simpler reason the skepticism ran so deep. Invasive species control has a long, embarrassing history of backfiring spectacularly. The introduction of cane toads to Australia to control beetles is the textbook cautionary tale, an invasive species solution that became its own invasive species disaster. Given that history, a healthy public instinct to distrust any headline involving deliberately releasing animals to fix an animal problem makes total sense. The crucial difference in Florida's case, and the detail that got lost in a lot of the online jokes, is that none of these programs introduced a new species into the ecosystem. The dogs go home. The tagged pythons are themselves removed once they've served their purpose in most cases. The hunters take the snakes out of the environment permanently. It was never predator versus predator in the ecological sense. It was closer to using every available tool, biological, technological, and human, to hunt down an existing invader more efficiently. So did any of it actually work? The honest answer is nuanced and worth sitting with rather than oversimplifying in either direction. Nobody involved in these programs claims that Burmese pythons have been eliminated from the Everglades, and realistically, given the terrain and the snake's biology, full eradication may not be achievable with current technology. That was never the promise. What the data does show is a measurable, significant increase in removal efficiency once these combined strategies rolled out. Removal numbers climbed sharply year over year as the Judas snake program matured, as detection dog teams got integrated into standard search protocols, and as contracted hunters gained experience. Researchers have also pointed to encouraging, if still fragile, signs of some native species populations stabilizing in areas where sustained, intensive removal has taken place over multiple years, though scientists are careful to note this data is still being studied and regional variation is significant. Perhaps the most telling shift is one of strategy rather than raw numbers. Wildlife agencies in other states and even other countries dealing with invasive reptile and amphibian problems have studied Florida's combined approach, particularly the Judas animal technique and the detection dog training protocols, as a model worth adapting to their own invasive species challenges. When your emergency improvisation becomes a case study that other regions actively want to copy, that's a pretty strong signal that the mockery didn't age well. None of this means the fight is over, and it's worth being honest about the parts of the story that are still genuinely worrying. Burmese pythons continue to expand their range in Florida, with confirmed sightings pushing further north and into new habitat types beyond the core Everglades wetlands researchers originally focused on. Some biologists have raised concerns about how far north the population could eventually establish itself as winters trend milder, though this remains an area of active research and disagreement among scientists rather than a settled conclusion. There's also the uncomfortable reality that for every python removed, an unknown but likely substantial number remain undetected, especially in the most remote and inaccessible parts of the Everglades where even trained dogs and expert trackers struggle to operate. The snake's camouflage, its slow, low-energy lifestyle that lets it go weeks between meals and months without moving significant distances, and the sheer size and difficulty of the terrain all work against total control. Researchers are candid that this is likely to remain a permanent management challenge rather than a problem with a clean, final solution, closer to how coastal states manage populations of invasive fish or plants indefinitely rather than eliminating them outright. Step back from the snakes for a moment. And there's a broader lesson in how this story unfolded that applies well beyond Florida's swamps. The programs that got mocked hardest online, the tagged decoy snakes, the sniffing dogs, the imported tribal hunters, turned out to be the programs built on the deepest, most specific expertise. They weren't gimmicks dressed up as science. They were serious wildlife biology and traditional ecological knowledge, presented in a way that sounded, out of context, like a viral headline. The gap between how something sounds in a 15-second clip and what it actually accomplishes in the field turned out to be enormous, and Florida's Python program sits right in the middle of that gap. It's a reminder that solving a genuinely difficult ecological problem rarely looks elegant from the outside. It looks like radio tagging snakes and hoping their instincts do the tracking for you. It looks like training a Labrador to ignore an alligator and focus on a smell. It looks like flying hunters across the planet because their community has spent generations perfecting a skill nobody else has. None of it looks impressive in a headline. All of it, together, has become one of the more studied and respected invasive species response programs in the country. So the next time you see a headline that sounds too strange to be real, a state releasing snake-hunting snakes, training dogs to sniff out apex predators, flying in expert trackers from across the globe, it might be worth pausing before you scroll past with a laugh. Sometimes the strangest-sounding plan is the one built on the most serious science. Florida's fight against invasive pythons is far from finished, and the Everglades may never be entirely free of them. But the tools the state built to fight back, however odd they looked at first, have quietly become some of the most effective invasive species control methods anywhere in the world. What do you think? Was this a smart use of resources, or does something about it still feel off to you? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the strange, true stories hiding behind viral headlines, make sure you're subscribed for what's coming next.